Hello there. My name is David Bowles, a product of an ethnically diverse family with Mexican American roots. I've lived most of my life here in the RGV, where I teach at the University of Texas and am the bilingual director of a local school district. I'm also the author of several books that center on the folklore and poetry of Mexico, the US Southwest, and the border that runs between these two areas and defines our lives on both sides. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the power of story to bind people together and bridge borders. When I was a boy, I remember asking my father why he could speak Spanish despite our surname, why all my cousins were Garza and Perez and Casas, why I was cursed to stand out not just because of my Anglo mother, but also because of my father's imprecise heritage. He was a man that straddled ethnicities without a word of explanation. And he told me, we're border folk. We come from bloodlines that cross and recross the boundaries of river and class and culture. Each of us is who he is, wholly unique unto himself, a wondrous admixture, if you will, of language and tradition. And he warned me not to be ashamed. And he promised me that there was no limit that I could not cross. Because like him, I was frontier forged, he argued. Now, for border folk, like those of us living in the RGV, a lot of us come across a philosophical term, nepantla, which comes from the Nahuatl, and it literally means the middle. And this refers to a sort of social in-betweenness. Great thinkers like Gloria Anzaldúa, Miguel León Portillo, and others have used the term to talk about a liminal cultural space that's often inhabited by mestizos and others who don't quite fit into one group or another, who kind of bridge those gaps. And growing up, I was definitely part of a Nepantla. My family, as I've mentioned, was Mexican American and Anglo, and our heritage was this interesting admixture of both Southern sensibilities and Mexican American traditions. And no better was this expressed than in the stories that my family would tell us. The stories I heard at the knee of my grandmother, Marie Garza, or on the ranch of my uncle Joe Casas, or in the bedtime stories that my father would tell me before I would go to bed every night. These stories like La Manopachona, Las Lechuzas, La Llorona, often very, very scary stories that nonetheless were something I hungered for, that the catharsis that came from them, the sense of belonging to a deeper, darker, broader tradition than I had ever dreamed of. It was really the meat of my personal growth, my identity formation. Thinkers like Carl Jung and Daniel Dennett, philosophers and psychologists both, have argued that story is key to identity, that we ourselves are the protagonists of stories that we tell ourselves as life passes by. And the stories accrete density and complexity the older we get. And so, in a sense, story is the fulcrum of our lives, the most important thing that we have. Now, when I became a teacher, after becoming the first person in my family to go to college, I was doing my master's in English and studying literature and thinking a lot about literary storytelling. And I tried, with the typical excitement of a graduate student, to get this across to my students at a middle school in Donna, where I worked, AP Solis. The second year I was there, I was teaching seventh graders. At the same time, I was teaching college freshmen in the Department of English at UTPA, and had a group of kids right after lunch who just could not be reached, it seemed, by the normal means that I had been trying for the past couple of years as a teacher. I would come in with a literature book, gather them round, try to share what I believed to be universal and very beautiful short stories and poems and so forth. But I couldn't reach the kids. The kids, rolled their eyes, told me, "No, hombre, no lo entiendo, está muy aburrido. I don't understand, it's very boring." And it was then that I realized that I was dealing with a group of students who came from oral culture. Walter Ong, a Jesuit priest and philosopher who wrote extensively about oral cultures and literature, talked to us about the features of orality, which as opposed to literacy. He extolled its flexibility, the personal nature of that oral culture, the continuity that exists from one generation to the next, the emphasis on memory, something that I saw a lot in these classes where children might have struggled to read but could remember things from years ago, stories that have been told when they were very little. And above all, Ong points out to us the emphasis and focus on community that exists in these oral cultures. And for me, this was a real breakthrough. Reading Ong and graduate courses while teaching these students, I understood not only that they came from an oral culture, but that I myself came from an oral culture. And that in my hard work to become a literate intellectual, college degreed person, wanting to write the great American novel, I had forgotten that oral part of my nature. And so I came into class after this realization armed with a renewed sense of purpose, and I tried something. I tried talking to them about the stories that my grandmother had told me. And immediately there was a connection. Immediately they began to look on me as something other than this very distant intellectual person who came from a life that they could not understand. And they began to see me as one of theirs, as part of the same tribe, if you will, the same clan. And we, in the ensuing months, talked so much about these stories, shared them, began to write them down. I began to show them how we could take the stories that we had received orally, passed down generation after generation, and embed them in a context that would create literary short stories and make the stories endure in a way that was different than the original way we had received them, but no less valid. And it was really here that I began to understand how solidarity comes from the shared weft of story that a community has. There's considerable cultural and political power in recognizing the shared stories of a community. It's something that can be used to facilitate social justice, to bring together a minority group that might otherwise be sidestepped or squashed by majority opinion and majority belief, and giving them this cachet of power that really transforms lives, both for individuals and for the community. And what's really, really awesome about story, moving beyond the individual sense of I am the hero of my own journey, the story that I'm telling myself, and beyond even we are all part of this larger weft and woof of story that creates our community and binds us together, to the idea that there are human universals, stories that go beyond just our personal selves and our community, and tell the fascinating and unifying story of every human being on the planet. There are, as Carl Jung and others have discovered, universal patterns in story from culture to culture. And these story patterns say something about human psychology, say something about the human soul that I think is really, really valuable. And my idea that I would love to discuss is the power of those universal stories and how they can be used to break the barriers between us, culture to culture, and show us that within we are all human, and that the interesting details and differences, the local flavor and dialect that each of us have within our stories adds on top of that universal tale of human existence and dignity that we all tell over the course of our lives. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the proposal.